Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are going to be having another conversation about Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, and likely there will be many more conversations about Metroid Prime 4 Beyond leading up to release, and perhaps also beyond. But we have gotten some interesting updates since the trailer came out last Friday during the Nintendo Direct, and so I want to speak on a variety of these different details that have come out. A lot of them I find interesting. And if you're a Metroid fan and interested in Metroid Prime 4, you likely also will as well. But what I really want to focus on is this overall conversation that's happening about Metroid Prime 4 right now. There appears to be something very special going on with Metroid Prime 4, and I want to dive further into that. So that's what we're getting into this time. To start things off here, Nintendo of Europe is actually pushing some interesting Metroid Prime 4 merchandising. So as you see here, there's some pieces of concept art for Metroid Prime 4. We've seen a lot of this before, but there's this design of Silex that I don't think we've seen before. There's this Metroid, there's this Morphball, we can't see that much of it. There are some logos for the game, it looks like. And that's neat. I look forward to seeing the full versions at a higher resolution in hopefully the not so distant future. But there's also this mousepad. And here's a closer look at the mousepad. This mousepad is an official piece of merchandising Nintendo's putting out there. And this is meant to facilitate playing Metroid Prime 4 Beyond with the mouse controls of Nintendo Switch 2. So there's a little bit of a push here to play Metroid Prime 4 in mouse mode. And we've heard about the mouse mode in Metroid Prime 4, we've heard impressions of the mouse mode in Metroid Prime 4 from Gamescom, from the Nintendo Live events, we've seen it play during the Nintendo Treehouse, and there's been an overall sense of positivity when it comes to the mouse mode. It really adds an extra layer of fluidity and precision to the aiming and the looking around, and speed as well. And reminder, this game also can run at 120 frames per second on Switch 2, which combines really well with the mouse controls and that high-speed, precise aiming. And so there have been some different games that have utilized the mouse controls on Switch 2 so far, but I have a feeling Metroid Prime 4 Beyond might be like the go-to game to showcase mouse controls on Switch 2. Something else we have seen from the Nintendo Today app are these renders of Samus. Here we see her in her Viola suit. Here we see her in her Viola suit riding Viola, the motorcycle that was recently unveiled. And here is another one that's clearly from the Amiibo. It's great to see Samus looking awesome. But something else that we have learned that I find extremely interesting is the estimated file size for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond Nintendo Switch 2 Edition. It is 31.6 gigabytes. This is pretty sizable. Now, keep in mind, this is being made by Retro Studios, owned by Nintendo, an actual Nintendo-developed game, and in general, when it comes to Nintendo-developed titles, they are pretty file size conscious. They design their games so they don't take up that much file size because of the limited file size of the Nintendo Switch and also the Nintendo Switch 2. And in general, Nintendo is known to have pretty great compression technology. They have made some pretty big games that have much smaller file sizes than other games that have much bigger file sizes made by third-party companies that aren't nearly as long. And so with this in mind, we should remind ourselves that looking at file size isn't necessarily the best indicator for how big a game is or how much content there is to enjoy. But I do think there is a very, very light correlation. Very light. Emphasis on how light, but still I think there's something to it. And so looking at the Switch 1 version of Metroid Prime 4, the file size is estimated to be 28.9 gigabytes. That's only marginally smaller than the 31.6 on Switch 2. And so this is actually a much bigger deal as a Switch 1 game. Another reminder, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, while the Switch 2 version does make it look better and run better, it's still made for Switch 1 in mind, right? Which has me curious about the future of Metroid when they make a Metroid Prime 5 for Switch 2 or something like that. How big is that game going to be? But focusing on this file size of this Switch 1 title, this is huge. There are very few Nintendo games on Switch 1 that reach this size. Yeah, there are some third-party games, but this is one of the biggest Nintendo-made games we've seen on Switch 1 from a literal file size perspective here. And so for some comparison, Metroid Prime Remastered, which is a pretty ambitious remaster, from a visual perspective perhaps the most ambitious remaster we've ever seen from Nintendo, has a file size of 6.8 gigabytes, which for Switch 1 standards of Nintendo titles, that's actually pretty big. But to see that the Switch 1 version of Metroid Prime 4 is more than 4 times bigger, that really has me wondering what's going on with Metroid Prime 4 here. And just for some comparable examples, we look at Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, a remaster on Switch 1, another Nintendo series on the console, 13.7 gigabytes. And so we look at the follow-up, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, 14.4 gigabytes. It's a little bit bigger. Now, we also go back to Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which came out before Definitive Edition, 13.2 gigabytes. And so I think the overall point to be made here is that remaster or not, all these games were about the same size. And these are pretty big Switch titles. They are vast adventures with lots to do, lots of content, lots of music. It all adds up. But then taking a look at Pikmin 3 Deluxe, another remaster on Switch, 6.5 gigabytes, and the new entry in the series, Pikmin 4, was 10.5. So it ended up actually being substantially larger than Pikmin 3 Deluxe, but not even 2 times bigger. And Pikmin 3 Deluxe didn't have an extensive visual overhaul like Prime Remastered did. And so I find it very strange to look at Prime Remastered's file size of 6.8 and then look at the Switch 1 version of Prime 4 at 28.9 being more than 4 times bigger, and that's definitely out of the ordinary. This is definitely something that sticks out, and it has me wondering, what does this mean? Is Retro Studios just using so much extra high detail assets in Metroid Prime 4 that it leads to this far larger file size? There might be something to that, but reminder, Prime Remastered was a pretty ambitious visual remaster, and it was only 6.8 gigabytes. My point being is that I feel like Retro Studios probably used some high detail assets for that game as well, relatively at least. Now, maybe they used higher detailed assets for Metroid Prime 4 on the Switch 1 version because they also knew there was going to be a Switch 2 version, and there could be something to that idea. But still, the thought crosses my mind that with this far larger file size, this game might just be a bigger, longer, more in-depth experience than any other prior Metroid game by a substantial margin. And that's extremely exciting, but also makes sense. Metroid Prime 4 is a modern Metroid game. It's been so many years since the release of Metroid Prime 3 back in 2007. Almost 2 decades. The standards for the scope and length of games now has expanded greatly, and so that may also extend to Metroid Prime 4 here, and so we could be looking at a pretty substantial in-depth experience, which, yes, is extremely exciting to think about. But on to this next bit of news regarding Metroid Prime 4. The Switch 2 edition is the #1 bestseller on Amazon right now amongst Nintendo Switch 2 games. This is amazing and is exciting, and it definitely has me wondering, is something special going on here? Like, there are other games that could have been higher up on the bestseller list, like Resident Evil Requiem or Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, and Metroid Prime 4 is above those games. And to add to this, Franz Saga on Twitter is pointing out that the Spanish Nintendo Store shops, both Metroid Prime 4 Switch 2 Edition and the Metroid Prime 4 Switch 2 Edition bundle, are sold out. Which brings me to the bigger point I want to get at for today's video. I believe it is looking like something special is going on with Metroid Prime 4, and that something special is Metroid Prime 4 reaching a whole other new audience here. What I've noticed since the Nintendo Direct, yeah, it's #1 on the Amazon bestseller for Switch 2 games, but there's also been a lot of conversation for Metroid Prime 4. There does seem to be an increased interest in at least talking about Metroid Prime 4. Now, you might hear what I'm saying thinking, well, yeah, there's a lot of negativity. That doesn't mean good things. Well, the thing about that is that oftentimes just conversation, be it negative or positive, is a good thing. at least in terms of marketing. And when it comes to the Nintendo fan base saying negative things, that usually doesn't mean that much in terms of sales. If anything, it might mean the opposite. Like, you look at the Pokemon series, and there is so much reason for negativity with that particular series, even though I love the series, and yet Pokemon sells like hotcakes. Or you look at the Galaxy 2 situation, probably gonna sell like hotcakes, but yeah, a lot of people are frustrated with the pricing, and I understand. But then you look at Metroid Prime 4, and I don't think Nintendo did the best job of marketing Metroid Prime 4 in the Direct. I think they gave us a very short trailer. They didn't tell us that much. The game's coming out later than expected. And I'll even say that when I saw the desert gameplay, while I still find it exciting, and I found it exciting immediately, there was an initial thought in my mind was that, hey, this doesn't look that visually impressive. This looks a little bit lesser than the rest of the game. And so I think there's something to that. I'm not saying Metroid Prime 4 is not going to look amazing. I think it will. I'm not saying Nintendo isn't going to market Metroid Prime 4 well. I think ultimately, once everything's said and done, they will. Arguably, they might already be doing so. But what I'm ultimately getting at is that this event, this Direct with this Metroid Prime 4 trailer, has started something. Something has changed when it comes to the conversation regarding Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. And I've actually been talking about this throughout this year, when I've continually theorized about this desert area, this vast open desert area at Metroid Prime 4 over the last few months. I talked about one of the reasons why this would make sense is because Nintendo would want to include some sort of vast exploration to really show a greater sense of adventure in this game, because guess what? Vast open adventures sell. It's not necessarily about being open world. Yeah, Breath of the Wild reached a whole other new audience, and the game went open world. But you look at other games that went bigger and more vast, but not open world necessarily, like Super Mario Odyssey, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, Pikmin 4. And all these series saw new record highs. Why? Well, it appears that there's a correlation with going with bigger and grander adventures and appealing to a larger audience. And so showcasing a big, grand, high in scope adventure with some vastness to explore, that's going to appeal to a larger audience. And I've seen people talk about who weren't that high on Metroid beforehand, but saw this gameplay in the desert with Viola, this new space motorbike, and people really like this gameplay. People really like the idea of speeding through this vast environment, doing all these cool things like these drifts, these attacks, these wheelies at super high speeds, with the overall atmosphere then leading into these other really in-depth areas that we've already seen in Metroid. That's exciting a lot of people. That's pulling people in. But yes, there are the conversations about graphics and such, and people look at the desert and think, oh, that doesn't look that visually appealing compared to the rest of the game. But something I should point out here, one, if you watched it during the live stream, maybe you didn't see it the best quality, and when I've gone back over it several times, I don't think it looks that bad. I still think it looks good. It's just more of a simplified desert because it is a desert. It's not a densely packed area. And something else to keep in mind here, this area is a vast open expanse running at least 60 frames per second. On Switch 2 it can run at 120, but even on Switch 1, this game is going to be running at 60 frames per second. There is going to be a vast open environment, and perhaps more than one vast open environment to be explored using Viola in Metroid Prime 4, running at 60 frames per second on the Switch 1. You don't see vast open areas running at 60 frames per second ever on Switch 1. And yet the wizards at Retro Studios, that's exactly what they're pulling off there. So I think we should just keep that in mind when looking at the desert. But sure, people are complaining about the visuals. People are complaining that this might not be a proper Metroid game because it's going open world, which it's not going open world. We've talked about in the trailer analysis. There are clearly still the Metroidvania style of progression, but there are some vast areas to explore. There may be some openness, some different patterns and sequences you can follow for progression, like prior Metroid games, by the way. But the overall point here is that there are conversations. People are freaking out about the game's structure. People are freaking out about the visuals. People are freaking out about the marketing, even though I think Nintendo likely will have a pretty jam-packed marketing period closer to release. I actually think this situation is very similar to how Nintendo handled Tears of the Kingdom, another big adventure. I remember in the February Direct before Tears of the Kingdom was released in May of 2023, we had just gotten a very short 2-minute trailer on the game. we were still left wanting more. We felt like we didn't know that much about the game. We hadn't seen any extended gameplay of the game. There were still so many questions. We didn't quite understand the hook of the game, what was going on with it really at all. And we were 3 months from release. People were thinking that the advertising team at Nintendo was sabotaging Tears of the Kingdom. And yet what happened closer to release? They kicked marketing to high gear, and Tears of the Kingdom came out to have historically great sales. It was the fastest selling Nintendo game of all time for a little bit when it released, and it eclipsed over 20 million copies very, very quickly. And so I'm not here trying to argue that Metroid Prime 4 is going to sell 20 million copies. I hope it does, that'd be amazing. But what I am trying to say is this. Metroid Prime 4 is a big adventure game from Nintendo, and we're actually seeing that the way that they are treating this game is very similar to how they treated Tears of the Kingdom, a big adventure game, and also how they treated the recent Donkey Kong Bonanza. Many people didn't know much about the game, they had shown only so much, and a month before release, they give us a Donkey Kong Bonanza Direct. We learned so much, the tunes changed on this game, there's so much more conversations on this game, there's an excitement and energy, and the game comes out, reviews extremely well, and all early signs suggest that the game has sold pretty well for a console that has just come out. And so you look at Metroid Prime 4, a very, very short trailer. There's still so much to know about this game. They've been kind of drip feeding us every few months, and it's looking like about 4 or 6 weeks away from release, similar to Donkey Kong, similar to Zelda, they're going to really kick marketing into high gear. At the end of this trailer, they show off the art book coming out October 28th, they show off the 2 Samus amiibos coming out November 6th, and the Sax amiibo coming out on December 4th. There are multiple waves of official Metroid Prime 4 merchandising that Nintendo has positioned here, and I think it is a sign of when the marketing is going to kick into high gear. They even show the trailer that during to launch begins when they're showing off all this stuff. They're implying that the marketing is going to kick into high gear at the end of October. So yes, I still think there's going to be like a Metroid Prime 4 Direct. Maybe they still even release Metroid Prime 2 and 3. You intertwine those things alongside everything else you said, some story summaries and just overall advertising, and Metroid Prime 4 is going to get its big push. But in the meanwhile, we're having all these conversations. It's fueling the popularity of the game, the intrigue and interest in this game. The showcasing of this desert area, while some Metroid fans are concerned, it's appealing to an audience that wasn't interested in Metroid beforehand. We're already seeing signs of that, and I think once we see even more about this game, once Nintendo truly kicks it into high gear, which is taking longer than expected because the game's coming out later than expected, something very special may be about to happen here. And to close out, I'll talk about the December release window, December 4th actually, we know the exact date. I did not want Metroid to come out in this month. I acknowledged it as a possibility, and I was leaning more towards late October, early November, and that's not what's happening. Some people think that maybe that was the initial plan when you look at the amiibo waves and when they're coming out, and maybe that's a possibility, and perhaps the game has simply been pushed back a little bit as we were hearing about from Kiwi Talks. Regardless, the game is making it out this year, and while I think it coming out in December might impact its potential sales because you're missing out on Black Friday sales in November, and you're also missing out on the game being nominated at the Game Awards, which would also increase the conversations. I think everything that's going on right now is still increasing those conversations, and we've seen other games from Nintendo come out in December and find success. Smash Ultimate, the best-selling fighting game ever, came out in December. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the best-selling Xenoblade game, came out in December. So I still think there's a great chance things are going to work out well for Metroid Prime 4, where it will reach a new audience with this new gameplay, with these conversations, be it negative or positive. Conversation is leading to more people paying attention to the game, learning more about the game. And so with that in mind, if you got to this point in the video, I would like to say thank you for watching all this time. I appreciate your support in watching this video. If you do enjoy my Nintendo news, rumors, and theories, consider subscribing and join the conversation in the comments below. Leave a like, share the video, get more people talking about Metroid Prime 4, because I think that's ultimately going to benefit the game, which will ultimately mean better sales, more popularity for the series, and a greater likelihood of continued consistent releases for Metroid, which is great news for all Metroid fans. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.